Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, Sheri Horn Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on February 9th, 2023 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that the show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, as usual, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you that you can listen to this podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast. And from there, you can scroll down that page and hear the most recent show and or search the archived listings for past shows that you might have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. And the show drops every Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern, so you can listen then or anytime. And while you're on that page, you'll see above the most recently posted show a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest, one of my major mentors, about what each of us, depending on our sun sign, needs to be happy. And this How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy advice is based on an interview I did with Stephen a couple of years ago, and he's kindly given me permission to distribute it more widely as a means of promoting the validity of astrology in our lives. And yes, it will sign you up for my weekly Conversations About Consciousness astrology newsletter, but you can, of course, unsubscribe anytime. So be sure to grab it when you listen to this podcast, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some words of astrological wisdom. Separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, where you can keep track of upcoming podcast content and other astro news you can use. I'm also posting now on Instagram. I did this week at least, so yay me. So feel free to follow me there as well. Thank you. Plus, I'm now offering a discounted 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125 to radio show listeners only. So, if you're interested in astrology and want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and you'd like to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back from achieving your most cherished desires in the areas of greatest interest to you, be it your relationships, your career and job, your finances, and or your health, then this reading is for you. We'll look at how the energies into which you entered into this lifetime may be keeping you stuck in old habitual patterns, or what I call conditioned behavior, and how this knowledge can assist you to make different, more positive choices moving forward. So, if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, that's easy when you take advantage of this special discounted offer for a Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. At almost half the regular price, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. Okay, so let's get on to this week's astro news you can use now. Many of us may have anticipated that the Leo full moon square Uranus and Taurus on February 5th would bring shocks and surprises, but most of us didn't know exactly what those shocks and surprises would be. And that's because frictional aspects to or from Uranus often bear the label "expect the unexpected." Now, a Chinese floating balloon the size of 3 buses was literally popped on February 4th, shot down by American military planes over the Atlantic Ocean near South Carolina after it had floated over the continental U.S. and reached the East Coast. So let's note that this balloon had been sighted by U.S. citizens several days before over Montana, leading up to the exact Sun-Uranus square, which occurred on February 3rd. So over those several days, people videoed this balloon, and it was headlined in the mainstream press as weird, exciting, novel, unusual, perplexing, and even scary to some. So what was its mission, people wondered, and some advocated shooting it out of the sky ASAP, and others speculated just letting it do its thing. Now we know that over the course of those few days leading to the takedown of the balloon on February 4th, that the Pentagon discovered it was indeed a Chinese spy balloon gathering data, especially since it had been spotted originally over Montana's nuclear sites. Well, it had been spotted by citizens, so you hear the rest. Now, as the monthly lunar cycle is currently waning, there's this from USA Today, and I quote, "The Pentagon did not shoot down the Chinese balloon as it approached Alaska in late January because it did not pose a military threat to the United States or Canada," the top commander for defending the United States said Monday. The balloon, which Pentagon officials said was built to spy on sensitive military sites, was shot down Saturday, and that would be February 4th, the day after the Sun-Uranus exact square, off the coast of South Carolina after entering the country in Alaska. Air Force General Glenn Van Herk, commander of U.S. Northern Command and the North American Aerospace Defense Command, briefed reporters on the decision to allow the balloon to track across the United States recovery efforts and previous balloon incursions. The balloon captivated Americans' attention, fueled rage on Capitol Hill, and created a diplomatic rupture with China. Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled a planned trip to China as the balloon floated over the U.S. The balloon measured 200 feet, and the intelligence payload was about the size of a regional jetliner and weighed thousands of pounds, Van Herk said. Debris from shooting it down earlier could have killed civilians on the ground, Pentagon officials have said. The debris field in the ocean off the coast of South Carolina stretches 15 football fields by 15 football fields, Van Herk said. It's being treated as potential hazardous waste because explosives might have been aboard to destroy sensitive equipment. However, there's been no indication that the balloon carried explosives, he said. By the time it crossed into the United States at the Aleutian Islands January 28th, the balloon had been assessed as a surveillance device. It did not pose a military threat, Van Herk said, so it could not be shot down. "I could not take immediate action because it was not demonstrating hostile act or hostile intent," Van Herk said. End quote. So after spotting this balloon over U.S. soil, another Chinese balloon was seen floating somewhere between South and Latin America with an undetermined mission as well. But we presume that, now we know. Anyway, that'll come clear in a second. So in addition, it's also now been discovered that during former President Trump's time in office, 3 such surveillance balloons were allowed to pass over the continental U.S. with no action taken. And then there's this from the Washington Post on February 7th, and I quote, "The Chinese balloon is part of a vast aerial surveillance program run by the People's Liberation Army," U.S. intelligence community says. The spy balloon effort operates in Hainan province off China's south coast and has for years collected information on military assets in several countries, U.S. officials said. End quote. As for China's response to the U.S. shooting down its balloon and the cancellation of the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken's planned trip there, it represents what appears to be the beginning of a war on words. especially a war of words, I should say, especially as we approach February 10th's exact Mercury-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, which occurs tomorrow. So, of course, back to the Leo full moon and all of the Uranian energy, just following the whole Chinese balloon fiasco came a bigger shock as the Leo moon squared Uranus and Taurus just hours before the exact Leo full moon on February 5th, when, and I quote, on February 6th, around 4:15 a.m. local time, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck south-central Turkey near the Turkey-Syria border, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, which is a division of the U.S. Department of the Interior. And again, I quote, just 11 minutes later, it was followed by a magnitude 6.7 aftershock. Though an earthquake of this magnitude is rare anywhere in the world, this type of event is generally expected on long plate boundary strike-slip faults, end quote. Now, I've read that it wasn't an aftershock, it was a completely different earthquake, so that's in dispute, and there may be more information that I just didn't find when I was preparing for this podcast. So whether it was an aftershock or a separate quake, I don't actually know. But my Virgo rising likes to be accurate. Or I should say it likes to try to be accurate. Anyway, this shockingly devastating set of quakes has killed to date over 17,000 people and left hundreds of thousands homeless across Syria and neighboring Turkey, according to the New York Times today on February 9th. Quote, the United Nations said on Thursday that it had sent its first aid convoy into opposition-controlled Syria since a powerful earthquake hit the region 3 days ago. Yet truck shortages, blocked roads, and other logistical hurdles are impeding efforts by the 100,000-plus rescue personnel working in Turkey, equivalent to the population of a small American city, trying to unearth victims, bury the dead, and provide aid to desperate survivors. It's difficult to watch this tragedy unfold, especially since we've known for a long time that the buildings in the region were not designed to withstand earthquakes, said USGS scientist David Wald. An earthquake this size has the potential to be damaging anywhere in the world, but many structures in this region are particularly vulnerable. And it goes on to say that the two largest earthquakes in the recent series are relatively shallow, with the main shock 18 kilometers or 11 miles deep, and the 7.5 magnitude aftershock at 10 kilometers, just over a kilometer, sorry about that, just over 6 miles deep. Because the quakes are relatively shallow, the intensity of the shaking is severe. And that's a continued quote from this scientist, David Wald. So, you know, it's interesting. I didn't think of this before, but, you know, as we're approaching the Mercury-Pluto conjunction, it's in Capricorn, and we're headed next week, it's almost a full week away, we're headed on the 16th of February to a Sun conjunct Saturn. Now, many might say it's way too soon to think that that aspect is in effect, but I think if we don't want to count that as being part of the obstruction or the blocked roads and truck shortages, etc., we look to the Mercury-Pluto conjunction that's happening tomorrow because it's in Capricorn. And Capricorn likes to slow things down. It likes to take its time. It's an earth sign. It's rooted. It's, you know, one of the key words for Saturn is lead. It doesn't move particularly fast. So given that, you know, the Mercury-Neptune sextile, which perfected on February 6th, which was right after the earthquake and, you know, when news of it spread, right? And Mercury was in Capricorn and Neptune in Pisces. This combination provided an easy opportunity for the world to express its sorrow and for all of us to pray for the victims and those still missing. And combined with the Venus-Uranus sextile on February 7th, which was from Pisces to Taurus, this clearly brought together unlikely partners, such as Israel, for example, which put aside its political differences with Syria to provide humanitarian aid there. So meanwhile, as we approach tomorrow's February 10th Mercury-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, here's what I wrote in my newsletter on Tuesday. Quote, an intense Mercury-Pluto conjunction in Sirius Capricorn February 10th may have some speaking their minds persuasively and others opposing their opinions. So watch for manipulative propaganda now. So what did I see in today's February 9th New York Times as this conjunction is clearly waxing, right? But the headline, Steve Bannon's podcast is top misinformation spreader, study says. And this is a quote from the article. A large podcast study found that Mr. Bannon's War Room had more falsehoods and unsubstantiated claims than other political talk shows. Which seems kind of weird if we go, were they listening to Alex Jones too? Anyway, the article continues, in a study released on Thursday by the Brookings Institution, Mr. Bannon's show was crowned the top peddler of false, misleading, and unsubstantiated statements among political podcasts. Researchers at Brookings downloaded and transcribed 36,603 podcast episodes from 79 political talk shows that had been released before January 22nd, 2022. So we're going back, obviously, a year. But when researchers compared the show's transcripts against a list of keywords and common falsehoods identified by fact checkers, they found that nearly 20% of Mr. Bannon's War Room episodes contained a false, misleading, or unsubstantiated statement, more than shows by other conservatives like Glenn Beck and Charlie Kirk. Overall, I don't know why they left out Alex Jones, but okay. Overall, about 70% of the podcasts reviewed had shared at least one false or misleading claim, the researchers found. Conservative podcasters were 11 times as likely as liberal podcasters to share a claim that fact checkers could refute, end quote. Now, so as we approach this Mercury-Pluto conjunction, sorry, I had to take a sip of water. I just want to remind everyone that astrology in general and astrological aspects specifically are neutral in nature. And that's because I believe the universe has no vested interest in making any of us suffer, nor does it control the way that we perceive and then choose to manifest or not these heavenly universal energies. Rather, they just are or become what we make of them. As astrologer Michael Luton likes to say, it's not what happens to you, it's what you do about it that counts. So, because Mercury, of course, represents communication as one of its major archetypes, and Pluto is often the outer planet most concerned with collective social reform, we kind of assumed that we could expect profound statements to be made by people of prominence, because again, it's in Capricorn. We see in the statements between President Biden and China over this balloon fiasco, and we saw it Tuesday, February 7th at the annual State of the Union address by President Joe Biden to Congress. And I mention this because I'm trying to illustrate that Mercury-Pluto conjunction, or anything to do with Pluto, right? It can be devastating, like this earthquake, which was triggered clearly by the luminary square to Uranus at the Leo full moon. But now that we're coming to this Mercury-Pluto conjunction, we can interpret it, or we can look for signs as to how to interpret it from both a positive or a negative angle, depending on what our specific biases or perceptions are of any particular issue, right? So I thought this was interesting, and I wanted to share with you a piece from Daily Kos, which is a site run by admittedly liberally biased Democrats. And it was written in response to the State of the Union speech on February 7th. And just as I'm saying, the energy of the Mercury-Pluto square is building still. So on the 7th, they wrote, quote, the headline, Biden baits Republicans into standing up literally for Social Security and Medicare. And remember, Pluto can be very manipulative. As I said, it can be, I gave you the example of the Bannon podcast and how propagandist it is. Propaganda can take one piece of truth and then manipulate it into lies, right? But I also always say, and I tell my clients, that when it comes to manipulation, there is no good or bad, right? If we're manipulating the 3-month-old infant into taking her medicine by standing on her head and making her laugh and open her mouth and, or doing the choo-choo train with the spoon or whatever, or the syringe, that's positive manipulation, right? If we're manipulating the little old lady, if the gigolo wants to, get a hold of her millions of dollars by flattering her and making her think she's 22 again, we generally perceive that as negative manipulation. So I wanted to use this as a kind of example of manipulation and the fact that this headline used the words bait because, that's a plutonic kind of thing, right? So the article goes on to say, a loose, masterful President Joe Biden gave a surprisingly entertaining State of the Union address Tuesday night, and never more so than when he was directly engaging with Republicans. Now remember, this is a liberally biased website. After an early dig at Republicans who vote against infrastructure spending only to ask for projects in their district, we'll fund your projects and I'll see you at the groundbreaking, he said. Biden really went for it on the debt ceiling, and in particular, Republican plans to hold Social Security and Medicare hostage to raise the debt ceiling. Biden started by detailing how we got to this point on the debt ceiling, how the national debt rose under his predecessor, while Congress voted 3 times to increase the debt limit. Tonight, I'm asking this Congress to follow suit, Biden said. Let us commit here tonight that the full faith and credit of the United States of America will never, ever be questioned. And he was clear about why that's a question mark right now. Some of my Republican friends want to take the economy hostage. I get it, unless I agree to their economic plans. All of you at home should know what those plans are. Instead of making the wealthy pay their fair share, some Republicans want Medicare and Social Security to sunset, Biden said accurately. I'm not saying it's a majority. Now, Republicans did not like hearing this truth, and loud booing broke out, and Biden went way off script, inviting them to contact his office for copies of the specific Republican plans to do just that. I'm glad to see, I'm telling you, I enjoy conversion. It means if Congress doesn't keep the programs the way they are, they go away. Other Republicans say, and I'm not saying it's a majority of you, I'm not even saying it's a significant number, but it's being proposed by individuals. I'm politely not naming them, but it's being proposed by some. And the article then goes on to say, and then he reeled them in. So, folks, as we all apparently agree, Social Security and Medicare is off the books, right? Cheering broke out. We've got unanimity, Biden cheered, beaming, and returned to the script for a minute. Social Security and Medicare are a lifeline for millions of seniors, Biden said. Americans have been paying into them with every single paycheck since they started working. So tonight, let's all agree, and apparently we are, to stand up for seniors. Stand up and show them we will not cut Social Security. We will not cut Medicare. And they stood. Literally, even Kevin McCarthy seated right behind Biden. Right before Biden pledged to veto any efforts to cut Social Security or Medicare, efforts that Biden had originally been planning to highlight are coming as part of the House Republican plan to take the economy hostage over a debt ceiling increase. That won't stop Republicans from turning around and demanding the thing that they were so outraged Biden would suggest they wanted. But Republicans have to leave knowing that Biden, the guy they like to portray as a bumbler in cognitive decline, got them on national television, and that he'll call them out over it again. End quote. So I just thought that was an interesting example of manipulation as we were waxing towards the Mercury-Pluto conjunction tomorrow, as I already said, but that depending on where your political point of view is, you either cheer or you boo, right? So I'm pretty sure most of my listeners are cheering. So now, when Mercury enters airy fixed ideological Aquarius on February 11th, where he'll stay until March 3rd, we may examine whether our thoughts, ideas, and goals are our own, or if they might be too heavily influenced by others now, friends, groups, community, tribe, association, corporation, whatever. People may speak in more ideological than personal terms during this period, and I thought it interesting, especially since Mercury in the air sign Aquarius represents flight, that just prior to the messenger god's entrance into this sign, that Britain pledged, according to the New York Times on February 8th, quote, to train Ukraine's pilots, signaling that warplanes could come next. And it goes on to say Britain's new promise to train Ukrainian pilots on NATO standard jets is just a first step, the country's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said on Wednesday, strongly suggesting the training pledge was a prelude to providing Ukraine with advanced British fighter planes to help battle invading Russian forces. With regard to aircraft, we have already said nothing is off the table, and the first step on that has to be to have people who can fly what are very sophisticated pieces of equipment. Mr. Sunak said at a joint media conference with the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky at a British military base in southern England. When it comes to fighter combat aircraft, of course they are part of the conversation, Mr. Sunak said, adding, we do need to make sure that they can operate the aircraft that they potentially could be using. Mr. Sunak has made it clear that Britain has shifted from its initial reluctance to provide Ukraine with fighter jets, though he has made no formal pledge to send them. At the news conference with Mr. Zelensky, Mr. Sunak said there are other allies involved in the question of sending jets. Doing so would require the approval of other Western nations, which he said Britain was talking to. So, Mercury moving into Aquarius, in addition to being flight, is association communicating with groups, right? Like-minded or ideologically like-minded groups. So we might remember, too, that initially when Russia invaded Ukraine nearly a year ago on February 24th of 2022, NATO nations refused to engage in any discussion about aiding Ukraine in terms of anything that had to do with crossing NATO's borders airspace. So apparently the barriers and boundaries have moved a bit since then. So let's stay tuned on this one, see what happens when Mercury is actually in Aquarius for this next month or so. Oh, and speaking of flying and airplanes, I read yesterday in the Washington Post that, and here I quote, Dutch investigators said there were strong implications that Russian President Vladimir Putin personally decided to supply long-range anti-craft missile systems to pro-Russian separatists before they shot down Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine, killing all 298 passengers and crew. And that was in 2014. So I don't know how many people remember that, but there was this, nobody knew who shot down the airplane. And it's a commercial flight, but it was crossing over Ukraine. So this article goes on to say there's not enough concrete evidence, however, to pursue a new prosecution, according to the same investigator. So they're pretty much pointing the finger at Russia for having supplied the, as it says, long-range anti-aircraft missile systems to pro-Russian separatists who inadvertently shot down the commercial airliner. But for a long time, nobody knew what was going on with that. So it's interesting now that Mercury-Pluto conjunction, we have an answer to that. And this reminds me, too, Mercury moving into Aquarius, of how Elon Musk, the man that many of us most love to hate since his takeover of Twitter last year, did aid Ukraine in the early days of the Russian invasion through his Starlink satellites, which allowed the Ukrainians to communicate through internet channels separate from ones the Russians could access. So it's interesting also to note that there was just a report this week, too, as we move towards Mercury's entrance into Aquarius, post Leo full moon square Uranus, and that there was this written in Time. I don't know if it's still called Time Magazine, but it's the old Time Magazine that moved to online. And this is a quote: "If you've heard of Starlink before, it's probably in the news about the war in Ukraine, where the government and army have been using it to stay connected. Starlink is a satellite internet service operated by Musk's space company SpaceX that currently has over 3,000 satellites in low Earth orbit that beam the signal back to users' receiver dishes. Its promise lies in its potential to extend coverage to rural areas and to the global south, but there are serious questions about whether that will be the ultimate use case." When the first few Starlink satellites were launched, it was a novelty to spot them, but that quickly changed as their numbers multiplied into the hundreds of thousands. Consider this: since the Soviet Union sent up its first Sputnik satellite in 1957, about 13,600 satellites have been launched into orbit by state and private entities, of which 6,700 are still active. SpaceX already controls nearly half of them and is pushing for many more. It has plans to deploy 12,000 satellites by 2026, but that could eventually expand to a total of 42,000. Now, after the first few dozen were sent into orbit, astronomers started to report a problem. And here I want to mention that I think this is related to the coming ingress of Pluto into Aquarius, which occurs on March 23rd. So we're going to talk more about that at length in a future podcast. But I go on to quote this article: "Starlink satellites are messing with the images that scientists were taking of space. When the satellites crossed the area being captured by their telescopes, they would leave bright lines across the image, making large parts of it unusable. As more Starlink satellites are launched, that problem will get far worse, and it won't just affect astronomers. Regular people are already spotting the satellites in the skies above us, especially around dusk and dawn, when they're most likely to capture the glare of the sun." Excuse me. "Starlight satellites are launched into low Earth orbit, making them easier to detect, and are released in a line, causing the series of streaks across images of space." Speaking to Vox, astronomer and physicist Tony Tyson said that once there are tens of thousands, you'll see the sky crawling. So, I think it's very interesting because I was just talking to someone the other day about how most of us will be gone, when the real effects of Pluto's movement into Aquarius comes to light. But with that and the movement into the age of Aquarius, out of the age of Pisces, ages of that sort are 2,000 years or so, Pluto will be in Aquarius for the next 20 years. But, and again, we'll talk about its retrogrades initially from March 23rd to November 24th of 2024. But it's interesting to me because I think if we go back, for those of us who are archetypally inclined astrologers or astrology enthusiasts, it's the stars that gave us our major myths and stories, right? So think about the sky in terms of something like this with all these added satellites, and how when you look up, you will no longer see the sky the way the ancients did, or even the way that we can see it still today. So fast forward maybe 500 years and, think about how perhaps you won't be able to see Orion. You won't be able to see the Big Dipper. You won't be able to see Cygnus the Swan in the south, or, some of these major constellations from which we take our archetypal stories that have formed the basis of, kind of human consciousness, at least over the last couple thousand years, right? So, just food for thought. Okay, not to beat a dead horse, but let's go back for a moment to the waxing Mercury-Pluto conjunction, which is happening tomorrow, which I think can be defined in one light as a war on words, as I noted. So it's fun to look at the conversation that occurred between Mitt Romney and George Santos at the State of the Union on February 7th. So when questioned afterward what was the deal when the two were spotted having words, Romney told the press, quote, he shouldn't be in Congress, and they're going to go through the process and hopefully get him out. But he shouldn't be here, and if he had any shame at all, he wouldn't be here. Given the fact that he's under an ethics investigation, he should be sitting in the back row and staying quiet instead of parading in front of the president and people coming into the room. Look, he says that he embellished his record, Romney continued, noting Santos's long list of falsehoods and fabrications. Embellishing is saying you got an A when you got an A minus. Lying is saying you graduated from a college you didn't even attend. He shouldn't be in Congress, and they're going to go through the process and hopefully get him out. Romney said he was unaware what Santos told him in reply and defended his choice to rip Santos to shreds. Quote, he was standing right there in the aisle, shaking hands with everybody. He also described Santos as a sick puppy to the hill. And Santos, for his part, followed up with a tweet directed at his Republican counterpart. Hey, Mitt Romney, just a reminder that you will never be president. So, I think we can see in this little microcosm the little snarky, plutonic, Mercury, Capricorn taking place in the House of Representatives. Hello, an institution, you know? Too funny, right? But pretty much a good example. Now, coming up on February 15th, we've got a Venus-Neptune conjunction in Pisces, which by the time it perfects will probably be greatly related, at least on the world stage, to the empathy and compassion expressed to those in Turkey, Syria, and the surrounding areas, as many grieve with them for their losses of life, not only their losses of life, but also of homes, resources, livelihoods, family members, etc. Now, Rob Hand, in his book Planets in Transit, describes this aspect as, quote, a refined spirituality in love with a total lack of selfishness and a feeling of complete soul union with a loved one, end quote. So I imagine many of us will be able, as more and more news emerges about the situation post-earthquakes in that region, to walk a mile in the victim's shoes. Now, a lot can happen between now and then. So, of course, God forbid, we don't want another tragedy or a natural disaster of the same kind. But I'm just saying, if we can relate it to the mundane world, in the collective, we can then bring it down to our personal lives. Now, Hand goes on to note that this aspect, Venus-Neptune conjunction, and this time in Pisces, may also bring disappointment in a loved one who, quote, did not live up to your expectations, which were probably unrealistic in the first place. Now, he's alluding to the classic rose-colored glasses many of us choose to wear and remain oblivious to any potential red flags in our relationships. So my suggestion is to heed his advice and use this waxing energy next week to selflessly relate to others, with, at the same time, keeping an eye out for potential deceit. Because what happens here, the rose-colored glasses thing, is that we can say, this is so cliche, but it's true. Shame on, what is it? If you tell me an untruth, shame on you. But the second time around, shame on me, right, for believing it still. So it's a good idea to keep some antenna up, because this is a sensitive aspect. So we want to watch out for self-deceit. Remember, the first time we're proactively deceived, the second time we allow ourselves to be deceived, and then it's our fault, right? But we can also, during this period, as this aspect begins to wax, engage in truly inspired creative endeavors. So that's the one way, that's the higher road, right? Take it up to the spiritual realm, channel something creative, doesn't matter what it is, and engage in it. And that way it's mindfulness, it's meditative. And when the sun conjoins Saturn in Aquarius on February 16th, we may find ourselves organizing and planning with an eye towards recognizing, our real duties and obligations going forward, as opposed to the ones that we simply think we have to do or comply with or take care of. And this can be also a time of professional advancement. But the key is to conserve energy. And when the sun conjoins Saturn, we might actually feel low energy then. But if that's the case, then we should tackle only the most important tasks. And when it comes to this kind of aspect or aspects related to Saturn, Stephen Forrest likes to say you usually have two choices at the end of the day: exhaustion or depression. In other words, you can procrastinate what needs to be done, keep it hanging over the back of your mind like a constant Eeyore gray cloud. Oh no, it looks like rain. Oh no, I got to do that. Oh no, and then you go to sleep or whatever instead. Or you can dig in and get it done. And at the end of the day, and Saturn is always hard work, right? At the end of the day, you fall into bed feeling accomplished but exhausted. So, as always, the choice is ours to make, right? Hey, so I was looking, when you look ahead, I was looking at the February 10th, tomorrow's Mercury-Pluto conjunction. And I noticed that Hygeia, the goddess asteroid of health, is not too far behind Mercury and Pluto. In fact, so I looked ahead and I noticed that she's going to conjoin. Now, Mercury, of course, will just keep going forward because he moves more quickly, but Pluto is hanging around the same degree for a while. And Hygeia, as I mentioned, the goddess asteroid of health, is going to conjoin Pluto and Capricorn. And at that time, they'll both be opposed by the Cancer moon on March 3rd. Now, that's looking ahead a bit, I get that, but Pluto Hygeia will also be on the midheaven, and the Cancer moon on the IC, or the bottom of the chart, the cusp of the fourth house, usually in tropical Placidus Western astrology, of the Washington, D.C. chart that day. And then I noticed that there have been several stories that are coming into prominence in the news, mainstream media, etc. And we know that President Biden has already announced that the U.S. will officially deem that COVID is not over, but no longer a national emergency by mid-May. I think I saw the date May 11th. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but somewhere around, I don't know why that day. But and this is when I believe federal funding will no longer be available to pay for either COVID-19 vaccinations or at-home testing kits. So, it's just interesting when I saw Hygeia, because the news has broken that Pfizer and Moderna, the makers of the coronavirus vaccine, or the two major makers, are planning to raise the rates for the shot by 400%, presumably just after the government is no longer paying the bill, which should be somewhere around mid-May. And according to the publication The Intercept, quote, the decision would increase the price from $26 to between $110 and $130 per dose, despite it costing only $2.85 to produce. Now, isn't that interesting for those who watched or read about President Biden's State of the Union speech? He specifically mentioned all these little hidden costs that people have to pay to corporations. He mentioned the airlines, and he mentioned the bank overdraft fees, and all these little fees that they tack on, late fees or whatever, and how they've been ripping off the American public, particularly the middle class, for years and years and years. So this is interesting to ponder with that kind of mindset, right? Now, this article then goes on to talk about how the COVID-19 vaccines were developed by the U.S. government using taxpayer dollars, and it states the following, quote, Pfizer and Moderna made record-breaking profits from the COVID-19 vaccine, but taxpayers funded the development of the COVID-19 vaccines in 2020 through Operation Warp Speed and the CARES Act. In the case of Moderna, the pharmaceutical giant does not even have permission to use one of the key government-owned technologies behind the vaccine. Pfizer's vaccine also derives from basic government-funded research on mRNA technology, which was funded in part by the National Institutes of Health. The billions in profits raked in by Moderna and Pfizer would not be possible without taxpayer resources and government-funded innovation, making the moral depravity of their recent decisions that much more repugnant. While Moderna and Pfizer continue to say the price gouging won't impact consumers, experts argue that it will cost taxpayers billions of dollars in Medicaid and Medicare funding. People on private insurance can also expect to see their premiums go up. Most significantly, the impact will be felt by those without health insurance. This type of corporate price gouging from Pfizer and Moderna will inevitably result in lower vaccination rates and increased risk to global health. The federal government arguably has authority over the pricing of products developed through federal funds. If pharmaceutical companies want to continue to callously threaten public health in an effort to price gouge life-saving products, the U.S. government has a responsibility to check them accordingly. End quote. Secondly, the news this week also included that a Trump-appointed conservative pro-life Texas judge will decide a case which, according to NPR News, quote, in Texas, that could dramatically alter abortion access in the United States, at least as much, some experts say, as the U.S. Supreme Court's Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision last year, which overturned decades of abortion rights precedent. A decision is expected soon. Now remember, I'm saying that on March 3rd, we've got this Hygeia Pluto conjunction being opposed by the Cancer moon. So Cancer to Capricorn, mother, father, right? Females, moon, right? In Capricorn, Pluto and Hygeia, institutions, restrictions, blockages, etc. So a decision, again, is expected soon in the case challenging the Food and Drug Administration's approval more than 20 years ago of the abortion drug mifepristone. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm pretty sure I am. Which a growing number of patients use to terminate pregnancies. Medical abortion, as opposed to a surgical procedure, is now the most common way that people terminate pregnancies. That's especially true in the first trimester when the vast majority of abortions occur. And I'm still quoting this article. Abortion pills are increasingly relied on by people who live in places where access to clinics is limited by state laws or geography. But now, a coalition led by the anti-abortion rights group Alliance Defending Freedom has filed a lawsuit in federal court in Texas asking a judge to reverse that approval. The anti-abortion group is raising, and here we have Mercury going into Aquarius also, the mail, right? Things that are being sent by air. The anti-abortion group is raising questions about the FDA's approval process from 2000 and some of the rule changes that have been made since then. They note that under President Biden, the FDA now allows mifepristone to be mailed or dispensed by retail pharmacies, while it used to be subject to more layers of restriction. They've loosened the requirements again and again and again, says Denise Harley, senior counsel with Alliance Defending Freedom. So now mifepristone is being given to women who have never even seen a physician in person. Under the recent rule changes, it's now possible for patients to receive a prescription through telehealth in states where that's legal, an option that major medical groups support. Normally, as the FDA has noted in its defense of its approval process, it would be unusual to pull a drug from the market after more than 2 decades of widespread, safe, and effective use. Yeah, kind of like pulling the 50-year precedent of Roe versus Wade, right? That decision is now up to a federal judge in Texas, Matthew, I don't know how to pronounce his name, it's Kacsmaryk, Kacsmaryk, a Trump appointee with long-standing affiliations with the religious right, including work as an attorney with a conservative Christian legal group based in the state. So it's no accident that the complaint was filed in Amarillo, says Elizabeth Sepper, a University of Texas at Austin law professor. The way the district courts in Texas dole out cases makes it so that there are a few places where you pretty much know which judge you're going to get, Sepper says. So they know they have a very sympathetic ear. Now, I would say this is probably not unlike what Trump did, although this isn't a Trump case, of course, but he had his own appointed judge handle the special investigator for the FBI raid on his, to recoup the classified documents from Mar-a-Lago and other locations, his home in New York, etc., right? So, again, Mercury, Pluto. Hang on, you'll see. Any appeals in the case would go to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, widely known as a conservative jurisdiction, and then to the Supreme Court. If Judge Kacsmaryk sides with the anti-abortion group, mifepristone would have to be pulled from the market at least temporarily. The FDA could choose to restart the approval process, which could take years. Jenny Ma stresses that because this is a federal case, the impact could be felt nationwide, not only in states with abortion bans. Both sides face a, February 10th deadline, Mercury Pluto, to finish filing briefs in this case. So I think it's pretty fair to say that we want to keep an eye on this aspect as it forms between now and March 3rd, which is, definitely a little less than a month now, right? So whether this case is going to the Supreme Court, which we know to be biased, my son, who's in law school now, turned me on to a podcast. He started law school in August, September of 2021. And around that time, this podcast became very popular. It's called 5 to 4, and it deals with looking at the 5 to 4 decisions made by the Supreme Court, either recently or in the past. And one of their lines, it's 3 young people, I believe they're all lawyers, anyway, discussing cases and discussing how justices decided them and discussing who was the lead, who wrote the decisions and things like that. But their opening line is, this is a podcast about how much the Supreme Court sucks. So it feels like Mercury-Pluto conjunction is the appropriate time to mention that. So, if and when this does get to the Supreme Court, but if this judge puts a stay on access to mifepristone, which I finally figured out how to pronounce, or remembered. I remembered how to pronounce it. Wow, right? Wow. So given the fact that some people have criticized Biden's recent State of the Union address for having put a abortion issue to the, saying he would veto any abortion ban on a national level that was passed by Congress, that he gave it very short shrift. But I don't think that's going to be the case for long if this happens the way it looks like it's likely to play out now. So in that case, especially if there's a cessation in the ability to prescribe this mifepristone to women by mail, etc., we are looking at, I think, a reinvigoration of what happened in the 2022 election for 2024. And that will potentially influence pro-choice people, not only women, but people of all genders, to vote against anyone who is anti-abortion, pro-life, or however you want to term it. So let's keep our eyeballs peeled, as I said last week, my dad loved to say, and see what's on the horizon. And I will be back next week with more astro news you can use. So thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me again next week on February 16th for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.